We're running a 2-hour seminar today. We're going to go 2 hours, maybe straight, depending on how we're doing on time, because there's a lot of stuff to cover. So if we're doing well on time, then we'll take a break in the middle. If not, then we won't. So people who need to get up and make themselves a cup of coffee, please just get up and do so. I'm Yoram Hazony. I'm the founder of Shalem. I was its first president for 8 years in the ancient history of the institution. These days I'm the provost, which is a fancy academic speak for the chief academic officer of the institution. And every summer I'm invited back to give a talk whose title is The Significance of Ideas in History. This is basically a talk which was originally designed to explain what Shalem does, what it is that we do, why we do what we do, why we seem to do what we seem to do, and why we don't do all sorts of things that people want us to do. And over the years, it's actually developed into a seminar that has for the students who come for the summer that often has some degree of personal significance, and we'll see whether that's true this summer or not. The reason for it is that over the years, with every passing year, the situation of students on North American campuses, and actually campuses around the world, of Jewish students becomes somewhat more difficult. When I was an undergraduate, which is already 25 years ago at this point, all of the same general issues existed with Israel being under attack and Israel needing to be defended, and questions arising about hasbara and information and what was true and what was not true, and why are the media so hostile to Israel. And back in those days, people were walking around saying, why does Israel have such lousy PR? This is terrible, this is a menace. Within 5 years, Israel is going to be destroyed, just like they do today. So some things don't change, but some things do change. And I think it's important just to get a bearing on this, that I don't think there's any question that the intensity of the animosity, the hostility, very often personal, at times outright anti-Semitic hostility, going to students and saying, because you're a Jew, you're responsible for what's happening in the Middle East. This kind of thing is something that, when I was an undergraduate, was completely unknown. I mean, I don't know, maybe it happened once in a blue moon on some campus, but the kind of avalanche that we get in our applicant pool every year, where probably a third of the students who are applying these days are students who actually use the term anti-Semitism in referring to things that are happening on their campuses. That's something that's completely unprecedented in my experience when I was a student. And I don't think there's any doubt that with every passing year, the situation does get worse. The students are faced both with the feeling, not a feeling, with explicit accusations from not just from fringe students, but from professors at times, and often from fellow students who are otherwise part of the political and cultural mainstream, not the most radical students, are faced with statements which explicitly or implicitly suggest that the state of Israel itself is illegitimate, that Judaism is in some way illegitimate because of the Jewish state, and then you have the phenomenon of students who actually say, I'm not defending Israel anymore. I don't want to be part of it. I'm not a Zionist anymore. Or even, I don't want to be part of Judaism anymore. I don't want to be a Jew. I don't want to be part of this because of what you're doing in the Middle East. Right? This is something that clearly is getting worse. It's getting worse in a radical way. And if it continues in this direction for another 25 years, then we could actually imagine a circumstance where on campuses in North America and Europe and around the world, it will simply no longer be legitimate to be someone who is a supporter of Israel, and will simply no longer be legitimate, even perhaps to be a Jew. You can imagine that kind of a horrendous outcome. Over the years, I've taken to drawing a little diagram which is intended to try to capture, at least as I understand, what it is that students are telling me year after year about what it is that they feel. It goes something like this. This is the ocean surface, and if you imagine, you all know that in classical Greece, the way that naval battles were fought were by bumping ships into one another, right? They had those big beaks on the front of the ships, and they would ram one another. And so we have basically what's being described is two of these little ships. What are they called? Triremes? Somebody actually know the answer to that question? I'm going to pretend they're called triremes until someone knows better, correct? All right, and they're bumping into one another. And one of them represents, the one side, and one of them represents the other side. And one person is standing and shouting his or her slogans, and the other person is doing the same. And the problem is that when you bump into, if this is the Jewish ship, or the Zionist ship, the defending Israel ship, when you bump into this other, the criticizing Israel ship, what looks like, it should be just, matched forces, right? It looks like, there's some of us students and there's some of them students. There's, we've got arguments, they've got arguments. We have passion and claims and the things we believe in and hold dear. And they have things, passion and claims and things that they hold dear. We're critical. We have people on our side who are on our side, whatever side that, on our side, but are critical, and they have people on their side who are on their side. Right? On the face of it, it looks like it's a matched fight. And the problem is that when this boat bumps into this boat, the moment that there's contact, it doesn't feel like a matched fight anymore. Right? It feels like something else. Okay, the something else is something like this. It feels like there's, underneath the sea, there's this ocean bed. And this thing, which looks like it's a trireme, it looks like it's a group of students, maybe with a professor or two, chiming in, but basically it looks like a group of students who are doing the usual student activism on behalf of a particular cause. When you bump into the ship, it feels like there's actually this sort of undersea mountain of rock, of solid stuff. And this thing isn't really a trireme at all. It's pretending to be a trireme, but actually what's going on is that there's kind of a mountain of something there. And when you bump into it, you're not bumping into a little boat like yours. You're bumping into something huge, something solid, something actually that begins to feel quite ominous and threatening when you realize that this means that you can't defend yourself. It means that the game is rigged. That's what it feels like. It feels like you can't possibly win. No matter how good the arguments you make, no matter how passionate you are, no matter how just you are, no matter how true your facts are, no matter how well you did your research, it doesn't make a dent. That's the thing that students are coming and say to me, I really just don't understand this. I don't understand what's going on. How could it be that if the issue is reasoned argument, we're here for reasoned argument, and I feel like I'm winning the arguments, but I can't make a dent? What's happening? Okay, now this question is the question that I'm going to try to give a preliminary answer to today. Okay, I'm going to try to answer what is this massive thing undergirding the struggle of ideas on the campuses, which makes it seem like it's a game you can't win. And not only that, which makes it seem like it is in fact a game that's getting worse and worse and worse with every passing year, and that could, God forbid, reach all sorts of terrible places in the future that we can imagine. Okay, now the discussion today, I'm going to run this this is a seminar, it's not a lecture. I'm going to talk an awful lot, so it's going to feel like a lecture, because there's a lot of new things that I'm going to cover that probably you haven't heard before. What I'd like you to do is I'd like for you to stop me for questions. Right? I'm just going to go straight through the period of the seminar, and what I'd like for you to do is when you feel like you've got something that you want to say or an objection that you want to raise, then do it during. Sometimes I'll say hold off for a few minutes, and sometimes we'll go with it, but don't wait till the end, because there isn't going to be any end. Okay. So, ideas on the campuses. Usually you all know that the universities are thought of as an ivory tower. Right? People outside the university tend to think of the university, educational institutions generally, and the universities in particular, as possibly the most irrelevant thing there could possibly be for the public life or the political life of the countries that we live in. Right? The image of the ivory tower, the metaphor of the ivory tower, is intended to mean people who think that they're way, way, way above everything. They're far away from everything, and it's hard to get in, and nothing comes out. You know, it's like the Washington Monument or something. You see it off in the distance, and you know it means whatever it means, but basically doesn't have anything to do with public life. Now, my thesis and the theory on which the Shalem Center was founded, the theory of me and my colleagues, is that this metaphor for academia and for institutions of higher education in general is mistaken. That in fact, what looks like an inert ivory tower is in fact something much closer to a lighthouse or even to a radio transmitter. It's a tower which broadcasts, and what it broadcasts is the ideas which are then later used in order to construct the reality in which we live. Okay? It's the source of the ideas with which everyone in society, the politicians, the media, the novelists, the people who found high schools, the journalists, the Supreme Court, everybody who's active in public life, in any aspect in public life, the source of the ideas that they use in order to construct the public reality in which we live is the universities. I understand that this is not a particularly intuitive way of thinking about it. People don't usually think in this way. So I'm going to try to make it seem a little bit more plausible. To begin with, let's start with what people take to be news. Okay, the New York Times has this slogan on the masthead, or it did the last time I checked. It said, "All the news that's fit to print," and that's the conceit of the media today. You know, maybe the New York Times is not the leading news medium. Maybe it's CNN or Fox News or something else, or maybe it's the internet. But in any case, the conceit of these kinds of news media is that what it is that they write about is what it is that's news. Right? That, you know, they think, if there's news happening in the world, we cover it. And most people who read them think likewise, that if there's news happening in the world, they cover it. And the reverse. If it's not in there, then it can't be news. Okay? What that means is that the particular kinds of things that the news media focus on are the things that we assume. We grow up thinking that those are the things that affect, you know, that affect politics, that affect the lives of nations, that affect the big events in history. Okay, but when you study what it is that they actually talk about, you see that actually the range of things that the New York Times or CNN consider to be news is actually very, very narrow. Almost everything that's big news for the news media is something blew up. Okay, somebody was killed. It could be an economic downturn, or which is to say, factories producing less stuff. It could be an oil well that ran out of control. But what all these things have in common is that they're all physical things. They're all very, very physical things. If somebody dies, if a bomb blows up and people are killed, that's news. If the factories slow down and then there's no more work, that's news. Okay, but all those things are very, very physical things. It's almost, it's almost as though Karl Marx, with his materialist theory of history, were deciding for us what it is that counts as news. On the other hand, what's strange is that even though the news media think that what happens, that physical things that happen, things blowing up, factories making more or less stuff, they think that that's what's news. They think that that's what makes history. They think that all the big events in history are basically being driven by those things. The fact is that the state, the nation, the things that are really what it is we're talking about, things like the Jewish state, right? Like the state of Israel, the Soviet Union, the United States, the nations that are being discussed here are actually not physical things at all. And this is a point that is difficult at the beginning, it's not intuitive, and it can't be emphasized enough. A political state is not a physical thing. There's almost nothing about it that is actually really physical. Okay, a state is a group of people a parliament is a group of people who sit in a building. Physically, they're like any other group of people sitting in any other building. The only thing that turns, the Knesset over there, the Israeli parliament, the only thing that turns it from being a square building made out of concrete, which really should have been nicer looking than it unfortunately is, with a group of people in it who really should be more polite than they unfortunately are. What turns it from being that into being the seat of Israel's government, something worthy of respect, of our respect, let's say, maybe our allegiance, maybe our loyalty, maybe. What turns it from a building with people to something that could command, or at least has, you can imagine it demanding with some justification, the obedience or respect or loyalty of people, is what we think of it. Right? There's nothing else. There's nothing else other than what we think of it that makes it from a building with 120 men and women into the seat of Israel's government. Right? And it's happened in the history of countries that people come to think, well, years ago, I used to think that building actually deserved my loyalty and was the seat of my government. But actually, now that I have more experience in life, and I've seen the kind of people there, I actually don't think of it as the seat of my government anymore. And I don't think that I have to be loyal to it. And in fact, if enough people start to feel that way, then what happens is that the country disappears. Okay, and in our lifetimes, maybe you guys don't quite remember it as clearly as I do, but we got to see the Soviet Union, which when I was your age, was the most powerful country on earth. It had 3 million men under arms. It had 10,000 nuclear warheads aimed at the United States and Europe. It was the most powerful empire that had ever been constructed in the history of the world. And the Soviet Union fell in a matter of hours. What? As a result of 500 rounds of small arms fire? No. The thing collapsed and disappeared without a trace, right, from the face of history, because people had stopped believing in the ideas that motivated it. But when people believed in it and were willing to serve it, then it was the most powerful empire in the world. When people stopped believing in it and stopped being willing to serve it, it was just a heap of tanks and planes and nuclear warheads that nobody could wield, and the thing collapsed and disappeared. Okay? This is true for every aspect of the political state. All right, let's take something simple like a border. All right, we tend to think about a border as though it's something physical. Right? The impression that you get is you have a map, right? And the map of the world, whatever it is, your Hammond map of the world, has outlines which are clearly physical, right? Because there's oceans which are clearly physical and land masses which are clearly physical. And then there's all these other lines, and you think that those things are physical lines because you drive around in your car, along a physical landscape, and you reach some point and you think, well, this is in physical space, and you cross the border, and so you think it's physical. But again, a border is not a mountain. A border is only a border because we think it's a border. If we and the Lebanese and everybody else in the world agree that the border between Israel and Lebanon is in a certain place, then it's in a certain place. If we don't agree, if we all decide it's somewhere else, it's going to be somewhere else. And if we disagree, we think it's one place and they think it's another place, then there's no border at all. There's just something that people are arguing, but there just isn't any border. It's entirely in our minds. Right? It's a question of collectively, we decide where that border is going to be. And you can't do that with a mountain. You can't do that with an explosion that kills people. We can't have a disagreement about whether a bomb went off, and that's a serious disagreement. There's a fact of the matter about whether the bomb went off, which is independent of what we think about it. But there's no fact of the matter about where that border is, which is independent of what we think about it. Okay? So when we think about Israel, when we think about fighting for Israel, about defending Israel, about the history of Israel, about how Israel came into being, the thing that we have to focus on is something we never focus on, which is the ideas in the minds of the people who constructed it and brought it into being. We usually think about what? We usually think about the farms and the factories and the fighter planes. But the lesson of the Soviet Union is that the farms and the factories and the fighter planes, they can be just fine. And the country itself can be so rotten, so lacking in internal and external support, that something comes along, pushes it over, and the entire thing collapses. And if we don't want Israel to turn out that way, then obviously to go the way the Soviet Union did, then we have to understand the ideas that are the basis of the construction of nations. Okay. Somebody want to comment, or now's a good time? Yeah, please.
You said that there's no questions of whether a bomb went off, that those things are considered fact. But in today's world, is that really true? We have people questioning something as documented as the Holocaust and questioning really whether that's fact. So has that paradigm sort of shifted?
Look, I agree with the thrust of what, both with what's on the surface and what's implied in what you're asking. All of public life is a matter of perceptions, and human beings' perceptions are, in very, very large proportion of the time, are based on things that other people might consider to be factually false. Right? There's no question that history is something that you construct. History is something that you can that is liable to my perspective versus yours. And it's especially liable to manipulation on the part of people who are unscrupulous and don't have any qualms about manipulating it. So I agree with all of that. But I'm trying to say something that's actually a little bit, I think, a little bit more radical, which is that the George Orwell argument, the description of the way history works, where everything is up for grabs. Everything can be manipulated. Everything can be the subject of creative reconstruction and outright lies, and those lies will always win. I assume there's some truth in that. I don't think there's complete truth in it, but there's some truth in that. I'm trying to say something that's, I think, a little bit more unusual, which is, let's say that you put together a group of people who seem to you to be like-minded in terms of the kinds of things that they consider to be facts. Right? In other words, they where do you go to school?
Cornell.
Okay, so we're talking now about not about people who are uneducated. We're talking about Cornell students who've taken courses in history, who know a little bit about archival research, who maybe lack all sorts of virtues, but the virtue of fairness is something that they actually believe in, and they try to be fair as much as they can, at least most of them. What I'm saying is that even that group of people, who could probably come to agreement about whether a bomb went off if you gave them enough time to explore the question, still, for those people who among them, there isn't going to be much question about whether a bomb went off or not. I mean, I'm not talking about whether the bomb went off 200 years ago. I'm not talking about like did a bomb go off last week? So you get on the plane, you'll go, you'll interview people, you'll look for the shrapnel, and probably all come to more or less the same conclusion about whether a bomb went off. And what I'm saying is that group of people, still, that group of people, if they believe that the Congress in Washington is something that is a state, is the capital of a state, that the people there are legislating and they're their government, and that the things that come out of that building oblige them, then there is a state. And if they don't believe in that, for whatever reason, then there is no state. And you can't do that with a bomb. You can't make a bomb cease to exist, disappear from reality by not believing it. But a state, you can. If enough people inside the state and outside the state say that state doesn't exist, then it ceases to exist.
But if enough people say the Holocaust didn't happen, then does it really even matter if it did happen or not in the end? Because if everybody believes that it didn't, then...
Look, in my opinion, it matters an awful lot if it did happen or not. Because the only way that you can decide whether something is right or wrong, right? I mean, assuming that we as Jews or as friends of Jews were people who actually stand for something other than pure naked power in the service of just whatever we feel like. We actually, tend to like to think that we stand for something, and that what we stand for is that there's a difference between right and wrong. We may disagree about what right and wrong are, but what Jews have done, the role that we see ourselves as having played in history is to have stood for something, and the something is to say that there actually is a difference between things that are right and things that are wrong. And those things depend entirely on facts. If Hitler was running an evil regime that was responsible for killing 6 million Jews and tens of millions of others, most of them innocent people in the service of certain ends which are as horrible as the means, if that's true, well, then you're justified in the terrible things that you did and that we would do, presumably, in order to fight them. And if those things are not true, then you're not justified. I mean, whether getting the facts right is the most fundamental aspect of getting to right and wrong. A court that doesn't get the facts right is a court that is not a court. It's just making arbitrary decisions on the basis of whim or power or myth. Right? So if you want to live your life according to believing that some things are right and some things are wrong, and then devoting yourself to those causes that you believe are right, then I think you'd better want to have the facts clear when you're doing it. Okay, so let's go on to the next piece. What I'd like to propose, which I think probably you can see this coming. What I'd like to propose is that the same, just as in economics, where there's a distinction between microeconomics and macroeconomics, and all of us are pretty used to that microeconomics is the economics of looking at a given company or factory, or even looking at hundreds or thousands of companies and factories and watching what happens. And that's a very, very different picture from macroeconomics, which is what happens when you ignore all the factories and just look at the money supply. Look at what the government is doing when it prints money, or where it raises or decreases the prime lending rate. I'd like to propose, for the sake of this discussion, something which I don't expect you to walk out of this seminar after a couple hours and be convinced of this. This is not an easy idea. What I'd like for you to do is I'd like you to try to be open to it and sort of set up a box in your mind where you put this thing in it. And in the coming years, I'd like for you to try this out. And try out this framework for understanding things. And in the coming years, you'll either come to the conclusion that it made a lot of sense or that it didn't make sense. I'd also be very happy if you'd write to me and tell me whether it ended up making sense. The distinction that I'd like to propose is that there's a difference between, in public life, there's also a difference between micropolitics and macropolitics. Okay, where micropolitics is pretty much everything that we usually think of as politics. Right? Micropolitics is what the pollsters do, looking at today's trends, tomorrow's trends, what happened in the newspaper today, who do we put up to run for office, is this guy or gal, are they good or are they not good, what did they say today or yesterday, getting the right strategist to run our election, getting the right speechwriter to write the right speech, getting the right message, getting the right spin, everything that we usually think of as the political life of a country, I'm going to put in the bin that we'll call micropolitics for the purpose of this discussion. Okay, and usually when people think of who won an election, that's what they think about. And in fact, justifiably, most of the time, if you want to know why an election was won or lost, then you look at these factors and you get an answer. Because you had a terrible strategist, because they picked the wrong candidate, because they picked the wrong message, because there was an economic meltdown in the middle of the election, because he picked Sarah Palin. Those are the things that people think, well, that's what decides an election. And in most cases, they're right. That is what decides elections. The same is true with regard to, like the flotilla. The flotilla is classic micropolitics. Somebody decided to run a number of ships across the Gaza blockade. Somebody decided to put certain people on those ships. They did a smart job planning it. Somebody in the Israeli government decided to counter it in a certain way. They did or didn't do a good job. The result is what came out. Then there's several weeks of running around trying to explain to people what happened. Did we do a good job? Did we not do a good job? Does Israel have lousy PR? Does Israel not have lousy PR? All of this is micropolitics. And if your question is at the level of why did that particular crisis turn out, less well or better than it could have, the answers are going to be most of the time micropolitical. Now, macropolitics is something else, because it's something that we don't usually think about as politics at all. Macropolitics is going to be, if we make a just imagine that there's a I don't know, what do you call this? Two different levels of reality. In philosophy departments, we would call it metaphysics, but you don't need to say that if you don't feel like it. Two different levels of reality. Right? One we'll call micropolitics, and the other we'll call macropolitics. Okay, macropolitics is what I would call the level of ideas. This is a level in which what's moving around, what's having it out, what's fighting one another, where the drama is, where the action is, who's winning and losing, who's rising and falling. The actors are not individual people. The actors are ideas. Okay? And the first claim that I'd like to make about the relationship between these two things, before I make a claim, what I want to do is just take one example of something that looks historical, that is historical, and try to show you that the level of ideas actually has a huge impact over the course of large spans of time on outcomes. The example is the establishment of Israel in 1948. Okay, probably all of you know that Theodor Herzl was the founder of the modern movement for the establishment of a sovereign Jewish state. He wrote a book called The Jewish State. In what year? 1896. In 1896, okay, Herzl wrote a book called The Jewish State. And then in 1897, he convened the first International Political Congress of Jews, the first World Jewish Congress. It was called the Zionist Congress, but it was basically the first time that there was a World Jewish Congress of any kind convened by anyone. He convened it in the Swiss city of Basel. Okay, and what he did basically was he invited famous writers and student groups and wealthy people and rabbis to come together and to talk about the establishment of a Jewish state somewhere in the world. Right, that was in 1897. This idea made a little bit of headway, got some interest of some people, but it really took off in a serious way with the Balfour Declaration, which is when the British government, Herzl actually was negotiating over many years or a number of years with governments all over Europe about establishing a Jewish state. It's really sort of amazing what he was able to do. But the British government formally, publicly adopted the policy of establishing a Jewish homeland, homeland for the Jews in Palestine in what year?
1917.
In 1917, right, with the Balfour Declaration, which is when the British government declared its intentions on the subject and then invaded. Lloyd George said, the Prime Minister of England said, the only interesting part of World War I was the Palestine campaign. Invaded Palestine, took it from the Turks, and then actually began a policy of allowing and even assisting Jews to come into Palestine. Hitler comes to power in 1933. World War II starts in 1939. In 1942, anybody know what happens in 1942? Absolutely stunningly crucial moment in the history of the establishment of Israel. 1942. 1942, an extraordinary session of the United Jewish Communities in the United States, with representatives from all over the world, voted to support the establishment of a Jewish state in Israel in 1942. It's a really absolutely stunning event, breathtaking. The Jews of Palestine hadn't yet made such a declaration, and only made that declaration after the Americans did, which is very interesting. So this is the first major Jewish Congress to declare that the political goal of the Jews as a people is going to be the establishment of a state in Israel.
This was representative Jewish communities, not Zionist movements.
Not Zionist movement. The remarkable thing is that beginning in 1942, almost all Jews support the establishment of a Jewish state. This is something that's very important to remember. It's very hard to remember because we see things through our own perspective from today. But in 1948, when Israel's Declaration of Independence is written and signed, it's signed by almost every Jew, like every political party among the Jews signs it. The communists signed it. Agudat Israel signed it. Like all the anti-Zionists, I mean not every last one of them, but the major groupings of anti-Zionists signed it. And both the communists and Agudat Israel fought in Israel's War of Independence. I mean, it was almost a wall-to-wall alliance. Which begins with the recognition of the Shoah. And all sorts of groups, Orthodox and Reform Movement and labor, all sorts of groups, Yiddishists, who had opposed the idea for decades, turned and supported it after the Holocaust. And the beginning of that is here in 1942. It's an amazing moment. It's called the Biltmore Platform, the Biltmore Declaration. Okay, World War II, so this is Biltmore. World War II, the liberation of the death camps in 1945. Okay, the beginning of the Irgun and then the Haganah, the war against the British. The struggle against the British begins then. In 1947, we have the UN voting to establish a Jewish state. Please note that the UN does not vote to establish the state of Israel. It votes to establish a Jewish state. an unnamed Jewish state. That is, they adopt Herzl's concept of a state of the Jewish people officially. And in 1948, the state is declared. Now, my claim is that with regard to this history, if you were watching it on CNN, would be virtually invisible. In fact, you can go back and check it. Go read the New York Times. It's virtually invisible. To us, when we look back at the history of this thing, right, it's obvious what the history of it is. It unfolds the way we're taught that it unfolds, and most of it is pretty accurate the way we're taught it. It begins with Herzl, and it ends with Ben-Gurion's declaration. And it has its ups and downs, it has its drawbacks, it has its successes and failures, but it's basically a straight line, and you can see the whole thing. But if you're reading the New York Times during those years, you can't see almost any of it. It's not there. Right? And if you were looking at CNN today, it wouldn't be there. When does it appear? Let's look. Herzl writes the Jewish state. Was that on the front page of the New York Times? No. Okay, that's something up here. This is on the level of ideas, way up there in pamphlet land. The guy's writing a book. He's arguing with Rousseau about what the legitimate justification of the state is. Right? That's the kind of thing people do in philosophy departments or in political theory programs. What does it have to do with politics? Right? You wouldn't even have noticed that this book would not have been reviewed by the New York Times, much less be on the front page as though it were news. The Zionist Congress. Okay, again, a bunch of Jews get together in order to debate and declare. I don't think it would have cracked this. I mean, maybe because the New York Times, unlike other papers, is a really Jewish paper. So maybe they would have given it like a little thing on page 17. Would anybody have noticed that a state, that a nation is coming into existence? No, we're still up here at the level of ideas. Right, and it goes on and on like this. The Balfour Declaration. This is real politics already. Right? This is something where you begin to see some kind of a beginning of an effect on actual national politics. But again, how important is this to the New York Times? How important is this to CNN? I mean, I'm sure the Jewish papers took it seriously. What Jewish papers there were. But this is not an important thing, and it goes on and on and on like this. I think that the first time that you
Coming
get...
of power to Hitler, or the beginning of the war, liberation of the camp, that was...
That was definitely. But again, so there's a war. Okay, so that's physical. What does that have to do with the Jewish state? What does it have to do with the idea of the Jewish state? What does it have to do with how does the state come... How does the idea of the Jewish state come into reality as a political thing? Right, so my proposal is that that you can't see that the Biltmore program, which is this crucial thing, that it also is not something that would have been taken seriously as important news. No front page or second page 2 or page 3 journalist of the New York Times was sitting and thinking and writing in the middle of World War II. Something really significant is happening here. It looks like the Jews are about to bring a state into being. Right? That sentence, people are beginning to think a Jewish state is about to be born. It's not there. Right? Even with the liberation of the camps, somebody like Harry Truman, who ends up being the hero of the story, right? Without him, there wouldn't have been a Jewish state. But in 1945, he has no interest in a Jewish state. For him, the Zionists are just the craziest thing. What do we need this for? What's his problem? His problem is he's a good guy, and the camps are liberated. There's hundreds of thousands of poor people who've had their families slaughtered, and they're sitting in these damn camps, and there's no way to get them out of the camps, and they can't go back to their homes, because if they go back to their homes, they get killed there, and there's no place to take them. He's got a humanitarian problem, and that's in the New York Times. The humanitarian problem. He's sending his delegation. He's trying to figure out what physically to do with these physical people who are sitting in these physical camps, and where can he put them? What does this have to do with the Jewish state at this stage? Nothing. He doesn't want to hear from Zionists. He doesn't care from Zionists. It's the idea of setting up a nation in the middle of the middle. It's completely irrelevant and gratuitous to him. Okay. It's not until roughly around 1946, right, that you get this effect, okay, where somewhere between 1946 and 1947, Right? When the United Nations is talking about, are we going to adopt the idea of a Jewish state in order to implement this in reality, then it's on the front page of the newspapers. Then CNN is covering it. Right? Then they go, wow, something's happened, something big is happening. Like reality is shifting. But the point is that even if you want to say, okay, there are little dips and ups and downs and whatever, basically, you can't see. The problem is that this level, the micro-political level, if you stay down here, then all you see is this. You can't see anything coming. The Soviet Union collapsed, right? The biggest empire, the most powerful empire in the history of the world collapsed in a matter of days. And how many newspaper reporters, commentators, opinion writers, who reported on this a year before it happened? 2 years before it happened, a year before it happened, 6 months before it happened? Who knew this thing was going to collapse? And we're talking about the history of the world happening in the most dramatic fashion, but it still looks like this. It looks like, we're chugging along, and I'm an undergraduate. I'm taking courses on the Soviet Union with top Soviet experts, and these Soviet experts are talking about the Soviet Union being a flourishing, a flourishing competitor to the United States. And a couple of years later, the thing just collapses like it doesn't exist. And these guys didn't mention a word. It's not like they say, there's a point of view that says, some people say that certain trends within the Soviet Union suggest that it may collapse. Nothing. It's like this, totally blind. You can't see. The problem with micropolitics is that if what interests you is whether you're going to win this election or not, you can see everything, supposedly. But if what interests you is the big changes, the major shifts in history, right? Big changes of the way that we live. Okay, I'll go through a couple of examples in a minute. Shifts from communism to capitalism, from only men vote if they own land to everybody votes, women vote too. Shifts like, do the Jews have a state, do they not have a state? Democracy, not democracy. We're talking the biggest Nazism. Is Nazism a legitimate form of government or is it an illegitimate form of government? Those kinds of shifts, if you are interested in those kinds of shifts, you have to be looking at this. You have to be looking at ideas battling one another and gaining support in the minds of people. The newspapers don't cover it. If you don't cover it yourself, then you're just not going to know what's going on. And what happens is that you bumble along through history, being surprised and surprised again and surprised again, but you don't remember that you were surprised because it seems so strange. We just, moving along, da-da-da-da-da-da, and all of a sudden, thunk, fully formed out of, it's like in the Talmud, you remember the legend in the Talmud that the temple is going to fall fully formed out of the sky someday and land on, right? There is such a legend. That's what this is like. That you're just going to be, going through history, and all of a sudden, thump, a few months before the Jewish state comes into existence, people start realizing that it's happening. Oh my gosh, what position are we going to take? Well, let's get a position paper on the subject. Okay, so this is an example. Somebody have a question about this? Okay, so this is one example. What I want to do now is I want to look at a few different examples of macro politics and try to understand just a few things about how it affects the political arena. Okay, and basically what I want to look at is I'm going to name a book. Basically, I'm going to give you the name of a book. Okay, like we did one. Here's one. Herzl, Jewish State. Okay, and what I want to know is, first of all, what year is it published? In other words, what year does it appear in the macro politics level? And then, what year? This is year of publication. This is year of impact. I want to know what year does this idea land in the micro-political realm right? It lands in our reality. It lands in CNN. It lands in the New York Times and is victorious. Okay, here it's 1948. And then the question is, how long is it between here and here? So how long is it?
52 years.
Right, 50. So this is 52 years. Okay, that's example number one. Let's do another example. Okay. Rousseau wrote a book called The Social Contract. Somebody know when this was written? 17. No, keep going. You're doing great. 17. You get half credit for the century. No, 17, beginning or end?
30, end.
Okay, 1762. And when's the impact? When do you have people marching around carrying this book across Europe?
French Revolution.
French Revolution, right? Which is when?
17.
Later?
After
Yes, it's after that, right? And this is and this is 27 years. Okay, Robespierre stands before the French National Assembly and he calls Rousseau that divine man. Right? And he says the social contract tells us the truth about the rights of men universally, and he starts sending people to the guillotine because it says it says in the social contract that if you don't accept the social contract, then you have to be exiled or killed. Right? By the way, this is where modern Judaism is born. It's with Napoleon taking this thesis from the social contract, and then he brings the rabbis together in a great Sanhedrin, and he says, either you declare that the Jews are no longer a people, a nation, or you're all exiled. And they did it in French, but in Hebrew they said something a little bit different. Okay, so here we have 27 years. Okay, Marx. Call his book.
Capital.
First book.
The Communist Manifesto.
There's an interesting discussion to be had about big books versus little books. They do different things. The first book, the one that makes the first hit, is called The Communist Manifesto. His big book is called Das Kapital. All right, and what year is this published? What? Right, 1848. Okay, and the and the Russian Revolution, the first successful communist revolution, is in
1917.
1917. And how many years is that? What?
69.
69. The reason I'm making you do the math is because I'm terrible at math and I get it wrong. I actually have the answers written down here if we can't do the math. Okay, Hayek.
Road to Serfdom.
The Road to Serfdom, thank you. This is the most important modern manifesto of capitalism. Do you know what year it was published?
Late 1800s.
No, not at all. Not at all. This is Hayek is part of the Mont Pelerin Society. These are people who during World War II get together and say socialism has taken over all the economics in the world. And they begin the modern capitalist movement in the 1940s. It was published in 1944, I think. Make sure I got that right. And and by the way, Churchill used this in 1945 he uses his paper rationing in the election of 1945 to print The Road to Serfdom and distribute it all over England, and loses the election. Socialism will kill this island stone dead. All right. When does this win? Where does this win?
1989.
No, sooner. Margaret Thatcher.
1979.
Right, 1979. Right. Margaret Thatcher wins in England, goes to the Chancellor of the Exchequer, to the Ministry of Finance, walks in with Hayek's The Constitution of Liberty, thumps it on the table and said, "This gentleman is what we believe here." All right, how many years is that?
35.
How many?
35.
35. Okay, here's a cool one. Kant wrote a small book called Perpetual Peace. Anybody know what Perpetual Peace is the founding document of? Perpetual Peace is, and not John Lennon's Imagine. Perpetual Peace is, even before John Lennon wrote Imagine, Kant wrote a book called Perpetual Peace in which he writes most of the things that John Lennon writes in his song. This is the founding document of European unification. This is the first time that I'm aware of that any significant thinker in European history, let's say at least in modern European history, says the following thing. Nations are nations. The existence of independent nations is not rational. It's a violation of reason. It has to end. The only reason we do this is because we're crummy people, and we should stop. And he lays it out. We're going to gradually eliminate the independence of nations on Earth, right? Because this is the only rational, right thing to do. All right, this was published in 1891, I think. Is that right? No, I'm sorry, I'm a century off.
Yeah.
But see, you have to correct me.
I thought maybe. I was like, oh, maybe
17
I don't really know who Kant is.
God, what's a really long-
1795, yeah, Kant lived a long time. 1795, and let's, I mean, I don't know if you can exactly say that this is one yet, but let's say, just for the sake of the argument,
1991.
in 1992, the Treaty of Maastricht, Europe at least proposes a union that's going to eliminate all the countries in Europe. It didn't exactly happen that way. It's still up in the air whether it's really going to win or not, but let's say, for the sake of argument, how far is this? This is
197.
how long?
197.
197. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I say I have them written down, but I could have miscalculated here too. So let's keep working on. All right, John Locke. Two treatises on government. Okay. Every time I give this lecture, I have an argument with the students about what year it was actually published, and I don't know the actual answer, but let's say it was 1690. Does somebody want to argue about this date? Okay, let's say for the moment that it was in 1690. All right, when can you arguably say that Locke's theory of government becomes victorious politically?
1789.
What?
1789.
What's in the French Revolution? No,
I mean,
1777.
1777.
yeah, I would say 1776. With the American Revolution. And how long is that? Oh,
86
It's
years.
approximately like 86.
86.
No,
Approximately.
approximately.
What?
Well,
Yeah, that's
It's approximately
because
exactly.
1690.
Right, if that's the date, it's approximately 86. It might be 87. I'll check that for you for later in the summer. Okay, one last one. Okay, anybody know the name of Mary Wollstonecraft's Manifesto on Women's Rights?
Vindication of
Right.
the rights.
Well,
of-
yeah.
Right, yes. Vindication of the rights of woman. Okay? Which is written in 1792. Anybody know the first place in the world where there's women's suffrage? Where women get to vote. First time.
It's a very random place.
Yeah, it's in South America, isn't it? Central
In the right
America?
hemisphere.
Mexico.
New Zealand. In New Zealand. In 1893,
Wow.
women for the first time get to vote.
So that's
Okay.
101 years.
101 years. Okay, now, okay, so here's what I'm not claiming, okay? I am not saying that every time that somebody writes a book, bam, wait 30 to 200 years, and presto, the world just turns over. I'm not saying anything like that. I'm not even saying every time somebody writes a really, really, really good book that happens. Right? It doesn't. It just doesn't happen. The overwhelming majority of the time somebody writes a really, really good book, nothing happens. But I am proposing something else, which is I'm claiming that every time that there is a really, really big shift, huge, big shift in the way that the public life of nations works, every time that that happens, first, that it begins with a book, and second, that it spends most of its life hanging around in that stratosphere where ideas are fighting it out and isn't really visible to the people who are only concerned about the things blowing up on the level of the daily newspapers. Okay? All right, so you could even, here it is. This is, for the purposes of this summer, we'll call this Yoram's Law. Yoram's Law. No macro political shift, no major micro political shift without a macro political shift. No macro political shift without a book. Without things happening at the level of ideas, which only much later get turned into what we're used to calling politics. The world is ruled by little else than the ideas of economists and political philosophers, both when they're right and when they're wrong. Practical men, right, that's the micro-politicians. Practical men who believe themselves to be quite exempt from any intellectual influence are usually the slaves of some defunct economist. Madmen in authority who hear voices in the air, right, telling them what to do, this Robespierre, who hear voices in the air, are distilling their frenzy from some academic scribbler of a few years back. Okay, that's this. That's what he's describing. Okay. This is a very, very important point that Keynes makes, by the way, about the way it works. Notice that what he's saying is politicians are constantly moving around in the micro-political. They're responding to, a new candidate who looks like a threat, new poll data that looks like a threat, new flotilla that looks like a threat. They're constantly responding to these small movements. But they still need ideas. Right? They still need to decide what to do on the basis of some kind of big idea. Every once in a while, they reach a juncture. They don't have any choice. They need to have some big idea of what that helps them to understand what to do. And those big ideas, Keynes claims, they never come from the politicians. Now, this is very, very, very different from what we usually think. They don't come from the politicians, and they don't come from their staffs. They come from something else. Right? They come from some kind of like a trickle-down mechanism. We'll talk about it a little bit later. Something that goes something like somebody writes a book, it's studied in universities, and then the people who graduate from the universities go around and distribute the idea, or the professors are brought in as experts. Some kind of mechanism like that, which means that the politicians, at certain crucial junctures, turn to, like Margaret Thatcher turns to Hayek, and she says, this is what we believe here. She didn't write the book. I mean, there are rare examples where the politician writes the book. But in the great majority of cases, the books that politicians write don't have anything much in them that isn't just recycled from these sort of original works, like Keynes's theory of employment, interest, and money. All right, so if this is true, if it's true that politicians ultimately have to take their big movements from somewhere, and where they take them from is from this level of ideas, then what it means is that anyone who cares about what happens in politics in the long run, if you only care about what's going to happen in the next 4 years, fine, but if you care about what's going to happen in the next 30, or the next 70, or the next 100, because you really want to change in a sort of strategic, macro sense what's going on, you want to change the big trends and not just the little trends, then you have to be in this game. You have to learn to play the game of macro politics.
Do you think that because we're in such a time of like access to information and to ideas in a much quicker way than, let's say, 1762, that this period between publication and impact is going to severely decrease?
I don't think so, but I try to not make predictions very often, because I find that it's a risky business and that we're usually pretty bad at them, and I definitely am not especially good at them. But I'll give you my opinion, but my opinion here is, I'm saying a lot of things that are, sort of very forcefully, because I'm sure this is the way things, anything having to do with predictions, it doesn't have that kind of level of certainty for me at all. I don't think it's going to make very much difference. I mean, I think what's happening with the new media, with the internet, is that micropolitics is changing. That the ability to cause to get out the truth or to cause a scandal and the speed at which it happens is changing pretty significantly. But I haven't seen any evidence that the new media increase the speed of propagating major shifts in thinking. Major shifts in thinking, my impression is that major shifts in thinking are usually generational. That it's not a coincidence that the shortest period that we have up here, and this is a very short one, is 27 years. I mean, you'll notice that, I don't know if this is all the examples in the world, but at least this set of examples makes it seem like there's no such thing as somebody writing a book and it taking less than a generation for there to be a major shift. And usually it takes 2 generations at least. I mean, when it's wildly successful, it takes 2 generations. And I'm not sure that's going to change. I'll tell you why. I mean, my guess is it's not. The conversation we're having is actually, there's an academic field which this whole discussion is taking place in the framework of. That field is called the sociology of knowledge. It's a discipline that studies the way that ideas move in society or through society. The most famous sort of mastermind of this field was Karl Mannheim. And the most famous book ever written in this field is a book by, I'll give you both. The most famous person in the sort of the big founder of the field is Karl Mannheim, and his most famous book is called Ideology and Utopia. This is a dense and difficult book, but brilliant. The most famous book ever written, by far, in the sociology of knowledge was written by a fellow named Thomas Kuhn.
Structure.
Okay, right, and the book is called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. This is a short book. It's quite accessible. This is the most important. This is probably the most important book written by an academic in the last 50 years. It sold something like 2 million copies.
I think it actually won, like Life magazine or something, is the most influential book of the last 50 years.
Well,
or something.
this is an amazing book, and if it looks like you're going to graduate from your undergraduate education without reading this book, which is 110 pages long, then you're making an educational mistake, or your instructors are, please just buy this book and read it. This is a book about the way science works. It's about the way that true ideas, or Kuhn wouldn't say true ideas, that's me talking. Kuhn would say new paradigms, new frameworks for how to think about reality, how they're created, how they are promulgated, how they're distributed, and then how they act once people have them. Okay, it's a brilliant book, and it's all written about science. It's all written about the Newtonian revolution and the Darwinian revolution and the Einsteinian revolution. Those are the revolutions he's talking about. But what he does is he studies what has to happen in order for one of these big revolutions and ideas to take place, for the scientific community to have its entire framework of ideas, not just the facts, but the framework from which they view all the facts. What has to happen for that to shift in a radical way, the way it does from the Aristotelian physics to Newtonian physics, or from Newtonian physics to Einsteinian physics? What has to happen? And there's a lot of interesting things in the book, but one of the things that's really relevant to the question that you're asking is this: that when he looks at revolutions, scientific revolutions, he basically comes to the conclusion that no one ever convinces people to adopt, sort of en masse, to adopt the new ideas of their new framework. That overwhelmingly what happens in a scientific revolution is that the old generation that grew up with the old paradigm, with the old framework for thinking about things, that old generation actually has to get old and die before the revolution is possible. Because what happens is that overwhelmingly, the overwhelming majority of scientists who are supposed to be, the most open people, and they're arguing about things that are the most, the most concrete facts. They're not arguing about politics or religion or something. They're arguing about, the results of scientific experiments, which are supposed to be reproducible. They fight. The great majority of them cannot handle the shift. They fight literally fight until the death. They fight until their dying day against the shift. And the shift is Kuhn says, almost always brought in by a new generation that grew up with the new ideas and doesn't see what's so horrible about them. My guess is that Kuhn, right, could be wrong. My guess is that Kuhn is describing something that's rooted in human psychology and sociology, and that it's just not going to change. That no matter how much you use the new media to speed up the bombardment of the people, the people holding the old paradigm together, no matter how much you bombard them, as long as human life expectancy doesn't change, and human psychology doesn't change, then this will be constant. Great question, though. Okay, let's take a break for just a couple of minutes, and then we shall reconvene. Please be back in 4 minutes. Let's do it. Okay, so three observations about this table, and then we'll move on. Okay, the first we already discussed. It looks from this table like there is no major shift in micropolitics without a shift in macropolitics, which is to say a shift in the realm of ideas. To a very large extent, they just don't happen. Second, I don't know if you feel like this about this, but every time that I discuss this, I get, when I get to this particular moment in the discussion, I get this kind of, very, very uneasy feeling, which it has to do with how malleable public life, how malleable the political world is. Because we tend to, I think it's just natural. Human beings tend to assume that the way things are is just the way things are going to be. We tend to assume that Israel's going to exist forever, and the United States is going to exist forever, and that democracy will exist forever, and everything else that's the fundamentals of the way our societies are. I guess that's just the way we are. We tend to think that they're solid, that political things are solid. We tend to think that political things are like physical things, and that they're solid and basically stable. And this gives the impression that they're not at all solid, and they're not at all stable. The only reason we think they're solid and stable is because we tend to live in this micro day-to-day where the changes are just not that big. But the moment that you move up, you move up and out, you open the range of your thinking to politics over a somewhat different, over an intergenerational span, over 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 generations. Wow, it looks like everything's in motion. Everything's in motion. Everything's up for grabs. It's not just, the miracle of the establishment of a Jewish state. The macro political world is one where things are in motion all the time. And the fact that most of us are not players, that most of us don't even pay attention, that most of us don't even know about it, just makes it all the more scary. That there's this world of ideas. It's going on. It's having its struggles. It's fighting things out. Every once in a while, it's going to drop some piece of news into our world. Hello, I'm here. And a year later, the whole thing's over. 2 years later, the whole thing's over. The change, the revolution, it's come, it's gone. And we never saw it coming. Well, if you combine that with how malleable these things are, things go from communism to socialism. The women do vote, they don't vote. There is such a nation, there isn't such a nation. They rise, they fall. It's scary. I mean, I think it should be scary to have that kind of massive influence on everything that we hold dear and believe in taking place in a place that we're not even paying attention to, that most of us don't even know exists. Third, is the issue that we began to talk about with regard to Kuhn, which is this is a different time scale. To think in these terms, this is to think in a way that's different from the way that most people, most of the time, the overwhelming majority of people, the overwhelming majority of the time, think about political things. Okay, and this is, in particular, I started by saying that the reason for this discussion is to tell you a little bit about the way Shalem works. And ever since Shalem was founded, I've been having people come to me and say to me, the house is burning. You've got to act. Things are taking place, and you know, I don't know if the sentence, I don't know if Israel is going to have another 10 years. I think I've heard that sentence hundreds of times. You know, like dozens of times in you know, in every period where there's a little bit of a flotilla crisis or something. I just hear it over and over and over again. I've heard it my whole life, my whole professional life. And I just don't think that way. I think that the state of Israel could really be destroyed. But I think the state of Israel is not going to be destroyed because of anything having much to do with, you know, with what happened with regard to the flotilla. Or every year there's a flotilla. This year it's the flotilla. Last year it was the Gaza war. Every year when I sit with the students, there's some other thing that's the thing that everybody's upset about and everybody spent months fighting about, and completely justifiably. And you have to fight because you have to. I mean, it does have an effect. But that's not the front on which I and my colleagues are working. That's the front on which almost everybody else is working. But we don't work on that front because somebody's got to be on this other front. And we're trying to think about how you work on this other front. What I want to do is I want to take, with the time remaining, I want to talk about one single idea, which is an important one in this struggle of ideas in macro politics, at the level of ideas. I want to take one idea, which happens to be the one that I think is most important for understanding what's happening on the campuses. I opened with the discussion of the triremes bumping into one another, and one of them is sitting on a mountain. And I want to try to tell you what I think that mountain is. Okay, I could be mistaken in the particulars a little bit, but I think in the ballpark, I think I'm right. All right. The idea that I want to focus on is the idea of the nation state. Okay, the idea of the nation state or the national state, the idea that in some sense the world is a better place, the world is better off if a nation such as the Jews is given, is allowed to have, is supported in having sovereignty. Sovereignty means the tools, the political, diplomatic, and military tools to be able to conduct an independent political life, independent of the decisions of other nations. Obviously, every nation is dependent on the decisions of others, but independent of having to take orders, to bow to decisions made by other nations, at least in theory. Okay, now this is an idea which is intimately related to the idea of a Jewish state. Because the idea of a Jewish state is one example of the idea of a nation state. It could be, I've met people in life who have said, you know, I don't believe in nation states. I really actually think that world government will be better, but there should be one nation state, the Jewish state. I've met people who say that, but that's not a position most people like to hold. It's not a popular position. It shouldn't be a popular position, and it's not one that I think carries very much persuasive power. Usually, when we think about the Jewish state. The state of Israel is the state of the Jewish people, the state that was founded according to Israel's Declaration of Independence and its political tradition, the state that was recognized by the United Nations, and the state that was proposed by Herzl. We're talking about a Jewish version of an idea which is a more general idea that came to Europe. I actually think that this is a Jewish idea. I think that you can show that historically this is an idea that takes root wherever people read the Tanakh, wherever people read the Old Testament. They come to like the idea of the nation state, and that's a whole really interesting question as to why. But in modern European history, the idea of the nation state is an idea that's it's an English idea, it's a French idea, it's an idea that's a few hundred years old and is associated in the mind of progressive thinkers, for example, of the 19th century, like John Stuart Mill, with human progress and liberty. Right? John Stuart Mill, when you read on representative government, and you see that he says that nations, that people should be able to have the ability to determine their own destinies, to speak in their own language, to think their own original thoughts, and determine their own destinies. He's taking what I think is an old biblical idea, which doesn't have any other classical sources other than the Bible, which re-enters the human discourse in the modern period, becomes a hallmark of progressive, decent thinking in the 19th century in Europe, and which collapses in after World War II, roughly in the 1960s. Okay. The reason that this idea, the idea of the nation state, is so important to us is because the idea of the Jewish state depends on the idea of the nation state. Where people think that the idea of the nation state is a progressive idea, where they believe, like Woodrow Wilson did, that self-determination of peoples is a road to the freedom of peoples, it's a road to decency and to well-being of humanity, it's a road to a human community which is better to live in for most or even all of the people in the world. Where that is accepted, the idea of the Jewish state follows as a natural consequence. It doesn't mean that every single person will agree to it, but at least in principle it follows as a reasonably natural consequence. And where the idea of the nation state or the national state as a way to attain human freedom is not accepted, then the idea of the Jewish state also tends to be not accepted. Where it's considered to be illegitimate and stupid and evil, the idea of the Jewish state also ends up being considered illegitimate, stupid, and evil. It may be magnified because some people like the Jews more and some people like the Jews less. There's also some particular aspects to the way it's applied to us. But if we're thinking in terms of these big paradigms or frameworks, the big macro ideas that we use in order to order reality and to make our decisions about what's right and wrong, the idea of the Jewish state is dependent on the idea of the nation state. And when Herzl was selling the idea of the Jewish state, he was selling it in an environment where he could count on not everybody to accept the idea. Lots of people in Europe didn't accept this idea. It was a tremendously subversive idea. But he could count on people who had read a lot of Tanakh, a lot of Bible, to sort of get it. He could count on people who were liberal, progressive type people to sort of get it. He could count on people who were looking to advance their imperial interests to sort of get it, because even though they were imperialists, they could see how that idea, which made sense and which could be sold to a lot of people, would help them advance their own interests. Okay. Now, this is an idea which, like I say, after World War II, this idea collapsed as an idea that was acceptable among decent people. I'm not sure I know enough about the intellectual history to be able to point to the book that led to the collapse, but certainly one of the books that was very important in this was Eli Kaduri's book, Nationalism. Eli Kaduri is usually thought of as a conservative thinker. In this place, he's running an argument that might as well have been written by Kant. Kant is the great opponent of nation states. And Eli Kaduri's argument is, although it's more guarded, although it's more scholarly, although it's more decent, it basically echoes Kant in saying that we can't accept this idea of a world in which different states are governed by different peoples, and those peoples then use the state in order to defend the interests and the aspirations of that particular people. And he specifically talks about Zionism in a way that is disturbing. Eli Kaduri, people consider him to have been a friend of Israel. I don't have any doubt about that. But very often people who say, I'm a friend of Israel, and then they go and they do their political theory doesn't necessarily square with their desire to want to be nice to their Jewish friends and to the nice people they met in Jerusalem when they went to visit. Let me just read a couple of lines from Kant, okay? Just so you get a sense of the flavor of the thing. This is from Kant's Perpetual Peace. Okay, where he says that we Europeans who try to be enlightened people, we look with profound contempt upon the way in which savages cling to their lawless freedom. Probably thinking about America in this case. We look with profound contempt upon the way that savages cling to their lawless freedom. We would rather engage in incessant strife. They would rather engage in incessant strife than to submit to legal constraint. Right? They prefer the freedom of folly to the freedom of reason. Their lawlessness, that's folly. Reason would constrain them and put them under law. We regard this as barbarism, as coarseness, as brutish debasement of humanity. Now, we might expect that civilized peoples, each united within itself as a nation state, would hasten to abandon so degrading a condition as soon as possible. But instead of doing so, each state sees its own majesty precisely in not having to submit to any external constraint. That is, sovereignty. What he's saying is the concept of sovereignty, the concept that the Jews, for example, should have an independent state and just be able to do whatever they want and stop any flotilla they want and nuclear bomb any nation. That idea, Kant says, this is the root of political evil. This is complete barbarism. Right? Every state considers that its glory is precisely in the freedom from any external constraint. The glory of its ruler consists in his power to order thousands of people to immolate themselves without anybody else being able to interfere and stop him and say, no, that's wrong. There's only one rational way in which states coexisting with other states can emerge from the lawless condition of pure warfare in which we all now live today. Right? Today, just as we did then. They must renounce their savage and lawless freedom, adapt themselves to public coercive laws. Right? Just like in domestic society, we live according to the Knesset, so too the nations have to give up their sovereignty and allow the courts in Europe or the United Nations General Assembly to decide for them what's right and wrong, what's legal and not legal, what's moral and what's not moral. They must renounce their savage and lawless freedom, adopt themselves to public coercive laws, and thus form an international state, which would necessarily continue to grow until it embraced all the people of the earth. Okay, now this idea, this is an idea which has been gaining. It's had shocking successes over and over in the 20th century, and after World War II in Europe, and in other places, but especially in Europe, it has a runaway success. Okay, many people in Europe, including much of the professorate and the journalists and a lot of the political leadership, many of the people in Europe look at the Holocaust. They look at Auschwitz. They look at the same exact thing that we look at. And where most Jews look and see, this is the result of Jewish powerlessness. This is the result of Jewish statelessness. This is what happens when the Jews don't have the ability to control their own destiny. We know that the British and the Americans could have bombed Auschwitz, but they didn't. Why? Because that's just not what their countries are built to do. Our country, the Jewish state, is built to do that. That's what its purpose is. Other people's countries are not built to do that. That's not what they think about during wartime. They think about other things. Right? Our lesson from Auschwitz, which in 1948, as I say, was accepted by almost all Jewish political organizations of every kind in the world. Our lesson is the exact opposite of the normative European lesson about the Holocaust. The normative European lesson of the Holocaust is look at the evil that's perpetrated when a nation is allowed to be independent, to care only about its own people. Right? To care, what is Nazi Germany, they say, other than a nation state? Which I think is nonsense, because nation states want to rule their own people. They don't want to conquer the whole rest of the world. But never mind. That's what I think. What they think is there's nothing more that more closely epitomizes the nation state than Hitler's Germany. Right? A people that stands up and says we care for nothing other than Germans, and will remake reality on the basis of caring nothing for Germans, using the tools of the state. And look what they did. 50 million people dead, the entire continent devastated, and the Holocaust being the ultimate example. Okay? We and they look at the Holocaust from two completely opposed paradigms, two completely conflicting paradigms. One with a tradition that goes back to John Stuart Mill and Edmund Burke, and the other which is Kantian through and through. Worse than that, the Jews are from the European perspective, the Jews are the ultimate symbol of how a powerless nation was unjustly destroyed, abused and destroyed because of the fact that somebody had power. Somebody had power that they could then give to the nation states, to their nation states. For them, the nation state creates, inevitably, racism, hatred, abuse, warfare, and ultimately Holocaust. And when we tend to look at it, most Jews still today tend to say the opposite. They tend to say, if you don't have a way of protecting yourself, if you don't have your own instruments of power, then you're at the mercy of others forever. The Europeans who look at the Jews as the example of the victims of the nation state, when they look at Israel, they see something sick beyond imagining. They see the victims of the nation state rising up and becoming in the image of that nation state. All right? So they would say, the Jews, the victims of Nazism, have become the Nazis. They've taken up the principle of Nazism and they've adopted it for themselves, and it's that they then go and use on others. Okay? The constant refrain that the Jews are like the Nazis, that the Israelis are like the Nazis, that the Jews are like the Nazis, it's not some coincidental thing. It's not some mudslinging that people happen to say it. This is at the absolute core of the ideology that's driving European Union, is the concept that in Holland, I have 600 years of glorious history. I have a biblical tradition. I have revolt against the tyranny of the Universal Catholic Church. I have the creation of the first Protestant society. I have the march of liberalism. I have world commerce. I have this glorious history of my fathers and grandfathers and great-grandfathers, and I'm going to give it up. As a Dutchman, I'm going to give up my tradition of my fathers for the sake of making sure that there's never going to be another nation state that's going to do to your people what the Nazis did to you. I'm willing to give it up. What about you?
Who says this?
This is a Dutchman. A Dutchman who's sitting in the Dutch parliament, and he's saying, I'm willing to give up on control of my borders. My little country is going to be flooded by non-Dutch. Okay? By Europeans, by Russians, by Arabs. My country is going to be flooded by non-Dutch. I'm going to lose the possibility of having a Dutch state within a generation or two. Why am I willing to do that? Why should he do that? Right? There's a reason that he's doing it. There's a reason that a Frenchman or a German, when they say we're going to give up our currency, we're going to have one European government, we're going to give up all possibility of exercising power any more than Nebraska has the ability to determine American monetary policy or to determine American foreign policy. We in France are going to give up, we in Holland are going to give up any possibility of independent policy setting for our country. They're giving up on the idea of the nation state, which in the Dutch case is an idea that was almost born in Holland. It's a very deeply traditional thing, like in England. And when they give it up for the sake of, well, the Holocaust is what happens when you have a nation state. So we're going to give up on the traditions of our fathers, and we're not going to have independent countries anymore. And then they turn to us, and we, the state of Israel, the Jewish people, to the extent that it identifies and still does to a great degree with the Jewish state. The Jewish people are the example of a nation that stands up against what they see as the course of the march of history, the inevitable end of barbarism and movement towards a civilized humanity. And Israel, the Jews, betray, listen to that word, betray the understanding of simple humanity, trying to sympathize with their plight, betray it by taking up Nazism and having their own nation state. Okay? Now, when somebody whose paradigm, whose framework is that one, when it's a Kantian framework, they then come to the facts and see the facts through that framework. Just as when I come to the facts, I see them through a framework that's in the tradition of Mill. Every time that I see the Jews taking over some ship in an embargo, you know what? I see the same thing when I see other nations doing it. Whenever I see a government, unless I happen to know that this government is conducting a Holocaust or something, when I see it, a government boarding a ship and taking it over, my instinctive feeling is, well, more likely than not, that government had some reason to suspect that that ship had something on it that was dangerous to the citizens of that country. They might have been right, they might have been wrong, they might have screwed it up. The whole thing might be just an act of total stupidity on the part of some soldier somewhere who made a decision. But that's part of wielding power. Nobody wields power without making mistakes. Nobody wields power without killing innocent people by accident. It doesn't make any difference how hard you train and how hard you work. The goal is to get to zero, but you never get to zero. Wielding power means that you make mistakes. So when I see any nation board a ship, my thinking is they probably had good reason to do it. Maybe they screwed up the thinking. Maybe some idiot gave the order. Maybe they didn't train right. Maybe this was unnecessary. But my framework is, this is basically a just thing. This is what nations are supposed to do in order to protect their people. That's why they have sovereignty. The reason they have independence is so that they can try to protect their people. But if somebody comes and watches this same event from the perspective of this Kantian, barbarism, they come to this and they say, oh my God, the Jews are again just shooting, just using power, just invading, just because they want to. Who gave them the right? Who would want to give them the right? That's what Hitler did. Right? That's exactly what we're all against. What we're trying to do, they say, is to overcome a world where someone can just decide to use power to defend themselves. And when you come at it from that perspective, it just doesn't make almost any difference how good the PR machine that the Jews or Israel have. Because the person who's sitting in front of that TV set, they already know the answer before they turn the TV set on. Right? The facts can budge them, an inch this way and an inch that way, but they can't get them to change the basic framework, which is that what Israel is doing is illegitimate. It's not illegitimate because they boarded a boat. That's just a symbol. It's illegitimate because they decided to set up a state that would be for the Jewish people, whose purpose would be to advance the interests and defend the interests and advance the aspirations of the Jews as a people. That's what the issue is. Now this view that the idea of the Jews having a state is illegitimate, this is an old idea. This is not something that was invented by the Soviet Union when they succeeded in getting Zionism declared to be racism. Okay, 1975, the United Nations, with a majority of Soviet and third world countries, basically what happened in 1975 was basically that a bunch of terrorist regimes decided that in their fight against the democracies it would be useful to tar Israel with this Zionism racism thing, and they succeeded. It was eventually repealed. But it just doesn't make any difference that it was eventually repealed. The reason it doesn't make any difference is because the idea that Zionism is racism is the idea that a Jewish nation state is not legitimate. It's the same idea. It's just using different words for exactly the same idea. The idea that the Jews do not have a right, it's illegitimate for them to get together and say, well, we want a state of our own. And people say, well, what do you mean a state of your own? There are non-Jews living there. And you say, of course there are non-Jews living there. There are non-Jews, there are minorities living in every country in the world. And they say, yeah, but you actually mean it. You actually are moving against history. You want to go back to barbarism. You think that the Jews should be able to use their state in order to defend Jews. Yeah, I do. I want to be able to send my army to Ethiopia to rescue 50,000 black Jews who've been sitting there, because no one else on earth would ever do that. You could appeal to the United Nations for 100 years. You would never get them to go in to risk their soldiers' lives, for American lives or British lives or lives of Fijian soldiers, to go into the mountains in Ethiopia to find Ethiopian Jews and bring them here. Yes, that's what I want to do. I want to be able to order my soldiers, you're a Jew, go there, risk your life, bring back the Jews there and save them. And they say, that's insane. How can you run a country like that? Don't you understand that you're a racist? You're like Hitler.
If these people are against the idea of the nation state as Israel is, then why would they defend Palestinian nationalism?
Great question. Great question. It doesn't make any sense. I can tell you what I think that they'll say if you press them. Okay, I think that this is what they'll say, but try it. Write to me and tell me if I'm right. I think that what they say is as follows, and this is a completely different theory, but I think it's what they say. I think they say, come off it. You know that they haven't reached the level that European society has reached and that you Jews have reached. And they will someday, but they have to go through the same thing you went through. You say, okay, first you have to let them build their nation, and then you have to let them develop themselves, and then you let them educate themselves, and we'll help them, and ultimately they'll reach a level where they'll want and be ready to join this community of nations giving up their weapons. But you know that they're not going to do that. And when we say, well, we know we're not going to do that, then they say, well, European Jews going back to that level? It makes no sense, but I think that that's actually the way that what they say.
Usually when I ask that question to people, they answer me that the Jews are not a nation more than anything about Palestinian. Because I think that's a big, I don't know, I'm not really American, I see the way it is in Europe, and it's often just, the Jews are not a nation, it's just a religion, so there's no reason.
I was going to say, there's a traditional anti-Zionist position in Europe, which was adopted by many Jews. You remember I told you that Napoleon, in the wake of the French Revolution, Napoleon conquers most of Europe, and Napoleon decides that he's tired of all the disorder that Jews are causing in his country. He wants them to be like everybody else. So he invites 70 rabbis to come to Paris, and he says to them, there's a new game in town. You're not going to be a Jewish nation anymore. You're not going to be a Jewish people. You have to give all that up. I know it says in your Torah that you're a people, but you have to give that all up. You have to give all that up. You have to become like Christians. You have to have a faith instead of being a people. Right? Instead of your religion being like a traditional aspect of your nationhood, you have to become like Christians. Christians have their faith is private. Public life is determined by the state. And so you're going to cease to be the Jewish people, and you're going to become the Frenchmen of the Mosaic persuasion. Right? That's the deal that Napoleon extracts at sword point. And for up until Herzl, that's the view that most Western European Jews accepted. I mean, it's not just the Reform movement that was anti-Zionist in the sense that it said we're not a nation anymore. Even the Orthodox in Germany, if you read Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, you see the same thing. That what happens is that before Herzl, Hirsch, his orthodoxy, basically accepts this definition of the state and recants and says we Jews no longer have any national aspirations. He says explicitly that we don't have a goal of trying to set up a nation. We give up on our national aspirations. Herzl's greatness, his shocking greatness, is his ability, 100 years after the French Revolution, not to declare that he wants a state, but to declare that the Jews are a people. Right? Read the opening pages, the second page of the Jewish state. It's not about a Jewish state. It's about us being a people. He says everywhere in Europe we've tried again and again to become just like the other peoples. It's not possible. You can't make people equal by issuing an edict in the Imperial Gazette. Famous quote from Herzl. You cannot make Jews cease to be Jews in the eyes of others, maybe even in their own eyes, but certainly in the eyes of others, by declaring them to be equal. There is no way to do that. We're a people. We've always been a people. We always will be a people, and we have to act like a people. Now, that idea was fought by emancipationist Judaism, right? Both the Reform and the Orthodox kind. It was fought tooth and nail. People said, Herzl, what do you mean we're a people? Do you understand what you're saying? What you're saying is, you're saying that we're seceding from the nations, that we're going to be disloyal to the nations in which we live. People fought that like they were fighting a madman. Right? I don't think a majority of Jews, certainly not in Western countries, believed this until 1933, until Hitler came to power. And then things started shifting in a serious way. 1942, the Biltmore Platform. What's incredible about the Biltmore Platform is that Jewish organizations like the American Jewish Committee that were organized in order to try to convince the Americans that Jews are absolutely American citizens in every single way, and they have no connection to Jews in any other place in the world that could be considered to be political. They have no connection to anything like Zionism. They fought Zionism in order to try to prevent Zionism from upsetting their position in American society. In 1942, in the Biltmore Platform, even they come to the conclusion that there has to be a Jewish state, and they vote for it. Right? And the Jewish people has, since 1942, the Jewish people has shifted to what I think is the historical Jewish view, which almost all Jews everywhere at all times believe, which is we need to return to our nation, we need to return to our state. But the anti-Zionist position between the French Revolution and 1942, the anti-Zionist position is the majority position among Jews in Western countries. It's the majority position among Jewish intellectuals. Somebody like Hermann Cohen or Martin Buber or Albert Einstein, these are people who fought tooth and nail in order to prevent the Jewish state from coming into being. Why did they fight it? They fought it because they thought that it would be racist. Okay? The arguments on the other side of this, on the anti-Zionist side, are deep and serious. Okay? The arguments, not just the arguments, the worldview that stands behind the anti-Zionist vote. This is a worldview that's deep and rooted in the societies in which you're living on these campuses. The idea that a Jewish state, right, is something that is, that a nation state is a violation of the idea of universal internationalism which is that violation of that is a violation of Kantian metaphysics. It's a violation of the idea that anything that's universal, that only something universal can be necessary or true. Right? Now we're talking about critique of pure reason. Only something universal can be necessary or true. This is a pretty serious worldview. We're talking about a worldview that can build up from metaphysical foundations all the way down to the flotilla. Flotilla is evil. Now you can't fight this thing with propaganda. You can't fight this with PR. You can push it around a little bit. But if you want to fight this, then you have to be good at this. If you want to fight macro politics, you have to be good at macro politics. You have to understand what it is that your opponents are saying. You can't just be saying, the anti-Zionists, it's all propaganda, it's all lies. It's not all propaganda and lies. It's based on a vision of the way the world works. And we don't have an alternative vision. We could have an alternative vision. Right? We could. There's plenty of sources in our tradition, in philosophical tradition, in the tradition of political theory. A world can be built out of nation states, and you know what? I think it would be more just than whatever it is that they're building out of the United Nations or out of European courts. But you can't just sit there and say, all they do is sling mud at us. We have to get serious. Right? That's what this place is about. Right? We have to get serious. We have to get serious about ideas, because if we're not serious about ideas, then we don't have a future. And you know what? I think that that's what Jews should be about. I think being serious about ideas is what Jews were about for thousands of years. And I don't think it's a big leap for us to say, okay, so there's plenty of people running around and saying, oh my God, the flotilla, the flotilla, the flotilla. There's plenty of people doing that, and they should be doing that. But somebody in this people has to be thinking about this. We want to build a solid nation in Israel. We want to build a solid Jewish people. We'll have to do it in a serious way. Thanks.
What about the other end of the spectrum in Europe now with this new guy, Dutch guy running for parliament who, I forget his name, but yeah, so who has come out with, who's very nationalist and has come out with open statements, quotes, I hate Islam, and wants to make all religious leaders only allowed to teach in Dutch. I mean, where do you draw the line then? Because he is someone who's retreating away from, I guess, this ideal of unification. And he's been a friend of Israel because of it. I don't know if that's necessarily a good thing in PR terms or not, but the other side of the spectrum there.
Well, look, not every reaction is going to be a reaction that we're going to like. I mean, this particular individual, I don't want to criticize him because I know nothing about him. So I'll take your word for it that it is the way you're describing it, that it's somebody I should have a problem with. But the whole point is that if we don't try to control, I mean, of course there's going to be reaction. I mean, there's going to be, I assume that at some point between now and when Europe becomes politically dominated by Islamic political agenda, which, if it continues in the current direction, that it ultimately will be. At some point before that happens, I assume that there's going to be a backlash. But that backlash may consist of people who are so odious that we would find it horrible to be associated with them. But if you don't want that to happen, meaning if you're a European and you would like there to be an option that's something between. Let's just leave our borders open until there are Muslim majorities in all of our major cities, and we can't make a move in this country without fear that somebody's going to be assassinated if he draws a cartoon or makes a wrong film. But somewhere between completely open borders and let's organize a new fascism in order to repeat World War II again, there is a sane position. The question is, who's building that same position? If you're waiting for the politicians to build it, forget about it. Keynes is just right. They're not going to invent it on the spot. They're going to take the ideas that exist and they're going to work with what exists, and what the options that they appear to have are options that we don't like, then we better build a new option. Not just for us, for the whole world. I mean, I'd like to help the Dutch. I'd like to help the English. I think it's I mean, we have a historical beef with the English of all sorts of kinds, but I love England. I don't want to see England disappear because and be swallowed up by some kind of French-German conglomeration. I don't think that's good for mankind. I don't think that the thing that's going to arise is going to be a John Lennon state. I think it's going to end up being another universalist European empire, just like all the previous ones. And it's going to be really bad news, maybe not in its first 30 years, but give it 100 years and it'll be a nightmare for mankind. You know, so I would really like for there to be a decent civilized alternative that's not universalist Kantian empire and not you know, some kind of fascistic backlash, but we got to work on it. That's our job. Okay, we've gone over. Anybody wants to keep talking, I'd be happy to hang around a little bit.